You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your five-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. Mike, I actually was realizing recently that we are now at Hotel Pacifico. We've just passed our platinum anniversary, which would have been our 20th episode, our
Right.
last episode. Yeah. Congratulations. Happy anniversary.
Yeah, we're steaming ahead to silver, and we'll be at what's 50? Is that gold?
I think that's gold. Well, for
Oh,
platinum though, I did think about what I would get you, Mike. I did spend a little time
really?
contemplating. I did, yeah, because I thought, platinum album, right? And then
Michael
which
McDonald,
album?
yeah.
Yeah, well, no, not quite. Which platinum album would be most appropriate for Hotel Pacifico? I was looking back, 1976, the Eagles,
Oh yeah, Hotel
Hotel
California.
California. Yeah, little piece of
BC, you can
Hotel
never
Pacifico
leave.
lore. Yes, little piece of Hotel Pacifico lore for our listeners. Actually, when Mike and I were first thinking about music for the pod, Mike had the fantastic suggestion of a violin cover of that song Hotel California, which if you have not heard and you need 3 minutes of Zen today, I highly recommend.
I can line you up with the right VSO musician for that.
Yeah.
Shout out Cam. Uh, well, I'm marking the occasion myself by being in the most westerly location that the air quotes family have done a podcast. I am here
Appropriate,
today.
yes.
I'm here today in Tofino. I've dipped my feet in the. Well, actually, I haven't yet, but I meant to
That'd be cold.
dip my foot in the frigid oceans of the Pacific, and so we're going. Taking a very coastal view of things today, and I'm really pleased to welcome to the pod my friend and our guest today, Greg Lyle. Greg's the owner and president of Innovative Research Group, which I had the good fortune of learning the polling business some years ago, working with Greg, who gave me the birds and the bees discussion on quantitative and qualitative research.
That's a birds and bees discussion.
Well, for me, it was I needed to. I was starting from very basic understanding. And prior to that, Greg and I also had the adventure of working together in the mid 90s when Greg came to take over Gordon Campbell's campaign around 1994. And I was the liberal who was part of the operation, and all these progressive conservatives showed up. And somehow we managed to coexist together. And hey, we won the popular vote in
There you go.
1996.
Moral victory. Felt like a new Democrat.
But Greg's had a lot of other political experiences too, going back to Brown Mulroney's leadership, Bud Smith's leadership, I believe, campaigns in Manitoba, a principal secretary to Premier Gary Filmon, campaigns in Manitoba, Alberta, Atlantic Canada. So he's bringing a wealth of experience. Greg, welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
Thanks.
Welcome.
And
Good
now
to see everyone.
let's start right from near the beginning of the Greg Lyle political odyssey. It's 1983. There's one of the most exciting leadership conventions in history of Canadian politics, and really it produced a new generation of young progressive conservative activists at that time, a very who I've become acquainted with over the years, a real tight group of politicos from across Canada who went on to do a lot of things in politics.
Absolutely. It was a pretty amazing time. And the most striking thing, I mean, the politics was one thing. But the friendships that came out of it, I'm sure we all have this experience. And when you work through a campaign, if it's a good campaign, you end up with friends for life. And I was fortunate to be part of a group of people that met at university and worked in campaigns across the country for decades.
It's something
So
about leadership campaigns, just to jump on that point, sorry, Kate,
yeah.
which is it's almost sometimes leadership campaigns tie those bonds tighter sometimes in general election campaigns. I don't know. Maybe it's
Yeah,
the nature of it.
I think they do. And, the old delegated convention was its own creature, right? So, you went to the floor. If your candidate dropped, you were making decisions about the future. And allowed people to jumpstart their careers. And so for me, I was initially with a guy named Peter Blakey who dropped out. Um, and so I like to say I was with the Peter Blakey campaign longer than Peter Blakey. And ironically, the day that he dropped out, it was pretty clear that the wheels were coming off that bus. And I was lined up to be Brian Mulroney's driver. And so I was actually the guy who, when he came off the plane from Toronto or Montreal, wherever it was, told Brian Mulroney that Peter Blakey had dropped out of the race while he was in the air.
Hmm.
And what did that tell us a bit more about that conversation?
Well, I mean, that was so part of being a delegate was that if you were up for grabs, and I was now very much up for grabs, campaigns would put you into situations where you had FaceTime with the candidates. So I drove both Brian Mulroney and John Crosbie. And um, and so Brian, everyone knows Brian was a very charming individual, and Mila was with him, and she's,
Even more
doubles that.
charming, yeah.
Yeah. And, John Crosbie is gruff, has an image of being gruff and really is gruff, right? Like he's a lovely man, brilliant man, funny man. But, not the same sort of tactics as Brian and Mila. So, I mean, you can imagine being double teamed by Brian and Mila when you've got that direct FaceTime. And so from ever after that, Brian would call me the driver. He'd run across me when I was principal secretary, and he'd be like, "Hey, Mila, there's the driver."
So tell
So
us, you're joining us, I think, just a couple weeks after the passing of the former prime minister. And we've ascertained Geoff is not allowed to eulogize Brian Mulroney. He's not invited to the funeral. But maybe, Greg, I'm wondering, what do you see as Brian Mulroney's legacy?
Well, I think Brian Mulroney was part of a generation of politicians that were substantive. And so in that leadership campaign, Brian had a book. I'm sure he didn't write every word of it, but he endorsed the basic ideas. The first substantive chapter of that book looked at productivity and real incomes and what that meant to quality of life. And we're going to talk later on about how that issue is now really driving things in terms of politics today. Um, today's politicians don't seem to think that way. And it wasn't just him, right? You can think about the Red Book with Chrétien. With Mulroney, we've been talking about things like the free trade agreement, the GST, now HST, but also things like the Acid Rain Treaty and his work on apartheid. You look at the Chrétien era with um, the permanent fix to the Canadian pension plan, which a lot of people aren't aware of, but Canada is a much better place than most of the advanced world in terms of the funding of our pension plan because of the deal that was done at that time. Chrétien, a lot of conservatives have a hard time acknowledging this, but Chrétien balanced the books, right? You can argue that Brian Mulroney took it a long way down the road, but he didn't balance the books. Chrétien balanced the books. And if you think about later politicians, you think about Harper and Trudeau, um, clearly they'll be noted for their stewardship of the country at difficult times, right? So Harper steered the boat successfully through the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And we forget how much of a crisis that was. I mean, literally, companies couldn't get the cash they needed to make things happen. And there was a real potential of a dramatic economic dislocation that would have made the Depression look like a walk in the park. And, he made a big contribution to that. And if you look at the way Canada responded to COVID, and you look at, um, how the average Canadian was cushioned from what could have been very devastating blows through the remarkably quick development and rollout of income support programs, they'll get acknowledged for that. But in terms of how did they change the country, what fundamental policies did they do that put the country into a better position, I think we're harder pressed to figure out what their long-term significant impact is going to be.
So childcare is not jumping out for you on that at all, or?
Well, childcare, maybe you could argue that it's incremental, right? It depends on where you were in the country in terms of how far along we were. But in that regard, it may well be seen as the equivalent of Pearson moving forward on Medicare.
Kate, can I just put a marker down here for later in the discussion? Because the free trade deal, which was so controversial at the time, very divisive, election was held over it. It was put through. Eventually, I think everybody, even me, got kind of reconciled to it. But I think, as you've said in other places, it didn't, as you said earlier, though, we're still back in that conversation. And when I hear Pierre Poilievre talk about the country being broken, I look around for corporate leaders, for example, who might show leadership fixing that. And in many, many cases, they're owned by very large international corporations. And it seems very difficult to see who would steer us through this current storm. So I just wanted to flag that because I don't know what levers are available for a new prime minister, as you say, to be substantive. And I don't disagree with most of your observations. I think you're right.
Well, you go ahead, Greg.
Go ahead. Well, no, and I think when you take a look at this, Brian Mulroney, what was his big thing before he became prime minister? He was president of Iron Ore Canada, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine a CEO of a big company like that becoming a political leader today?
No.
And yet, he learned some really important things in that job. And running the government of Canada is the single biggest enterprise in this country. Yet that talent pool is not running.
Well, I wanted to, because that relates to the point I think you were making about the difference to Mulroney to politicians today and the way he operated and the way he understood the role and the kind of depth. I'm kind of interpreting here, but I think kind of the depth and appetite for policy he brought. Do you look at that as sort of a manifestation of the quality of the candidates are running, or is that a manifestation of sort of the media climate, the sort of way we consume political news now compared to then? Is it both?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, there was a big attitudinal change in this country around 1990, and if you were going to put a date on it. And there's a book on it, and that book's called The Decline of Deference. And so prior to 1990, we looked to government to lead, and we primarily saw ourselves as following. Since 1990, when you measure the difference between people that say we should rely on the common sense of the average person versus politics is complicated, we should rely on experts. On any given month, there's about 20% more that say, let's rely on common sense, not experts. And there's some reasons for that. I mean, one thing that government has not come to grips with is, we designed the parliamentary systems we have today in the 1890s. I mean, that's really when it came of age, at a period of time where government knew more, really did know more than the average Canadian. They had better access to facts. They were better educated. Well, nowadays, you look at the average education, the fact that any one of us on a phone can find out pretty much anything we want on the spur of the moment. Government doesn't have a monopoly on knowledge or wisdom, for sure. And we haven't adjusted to that. And I think that's part of the problem. We've had these big trends happen, and we're so caught up in day-to-day survival in politics that we don't get a chance to sit back and say, but, what do we need to do to bring the system up to speed with the realities of knowledge and power today?
And
Well,
I want to relate that real quick. Can I relate it real quick to another book? I think
Sure.
I haven't read The Decline of Deference, but I'm thinking of Listen Liberal. That sort of flips it, right? And so, sorry, Listen Liberal is that sort of idea that that government got into this place of elitism and sort of kind of condescending to the voter without really understanding what the implications would be on the ground. And I'm wondering, like, is the deference piece do you see those things as interrelated? That lack of deference, a manifestation of sort of a top-down elitism potentially in politics?
Yeah, I would agree.
Sorry, Mike, go ahead. Yeah.
We're just fighting for airtime here today.
It's too good.
Professor
It's too
Lyle.
I
good.
got that answer short.
I
got
like
that one short.
yeah.
Well, you mentioned 1990 as a pivot point, and if I can tie that into the Mulroney legacy, that was a problematic. It could have gone different ways in 1990. A lot happened in 1990. That was the culmination of the Meech Lake Accord. It was when Chrétien won the leadership. And for those who listen to the podcast who weren't even born then, there was 1 week in June where it all came to a crashing head, where the Meech Lake Accord failed, Chrétien defeated Paul Martin, and the rise of the Bloc Québécois happened instantly, with Lucien Bouchard and other members and Liberals members joining that, and ultimately the takeoff of the Reform Party in Western Canada. So, you mentioned people were wanting to be less deferential, around that time, and maybe the rise of populism. We've seen populism in the past too, but that really took off both in different manifestations in Quebec and Western Canada, and it never got put back together again. And
No,
so,
but again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
yeah.
Right. I mean, from the point of view of having a functional democracy, we have better educated people with better access to information than we ever had before. But our politicians seem to want to keep running the country like it was 1890 and not 2024. And, we had talked about this back in the Christy Clark days, and I had suggested that she might want to think about a model of being a talk show premier.
Mm.
And if you think about what a talk radio host does, is that they listen to their callers to figure out what's bothering them. They pull together experts to throw ideas out and get people to react to those ideas. But what a premier can do that a talk show host can't do is then pick a winning idea and say that we're going to run with that.
Mhm.
I see
And if
that
you
in
pull that,
Danielle Smith too. Much.
yeah, and Danielle Smith, I would argue, I don't think she gets everything right every day, but one thing about Danielle Smith is that she learns and adjusts. And so, we'll see how history treats her and how she matures as a leader. But she's at least sort of moving in that direction. And another person like that is Doug Ford. So, with Doug Ford, I think it's a little bit different. Doug Ford brings a sort of small business sensibility to government. And so for Doug Ford, his ideology is customer service, right? The customer is always right. How do I keep my customer happy? And um, and so, when the polls come out, yeah, he looks at them as a politician and says, I need to react to this. But he also looks at them as a small business proprietor saying, I've done something wrong here. I've lost my connection to my customer. I need to reconnect. And that brings an authenticity. Whereas another politician, it would look like a tactic. For him, it looks like his underlying personality.
Yeah, he can authentically backwalk. He can change his mind, and it's not flip-flopping.
Right.
It's I heard you.
Right. Exactly. And so that what I would argue is that um, that I think more politicians should take that lesson on board.
Mm.
I think that there should be more respect given to what the average person can know, and what that does is that it creates a need to structure conversations, because what you don't want is knee-jerk reactions based on half truths, right? What you want is an informed discussion that leads to an informed opinion in terms of the public. That's not an easy thing to do, and few people are trying. But if we don't embrace that sort of problem, it's hard to imagine how we're going to have functional politics.
Don't you think Pierre Poilievre is making that move? And a lot of the people who don't like his politics are frustrated at how well he's connecting, because
Right.
they look at his political career and go, oh, he's not a true man of the blue collar crowd. He's just making this up to get along, but he's making it connect. Why do you think he's successful at that? How is he doing that?
Well, I think at the moment he's the only politician actually addressing these underlying concerns that people have in terms of their standard of living.
Mhm.
We have some numbers that I know we're going to talk about that show that that looking at the same group of people over time, there's been a dramatic decline in the average Canadian's satisfaction with their current standard of living, their perception of how they're doing compared to previous generations, and their perception of how future generations will do. All of those numbers have declined, and they have particularly declined among the youngest generations, to where Canadians are now fundamentally pessimistic about the future. And so, whether you want to use the language of broken or not, the idea that there was a promise in Canada that, you know, if you work hard, obey the law, pay your taxes, that you will get ahead, that you will have a certain quality of life. But when you have the stagnant or declining real incomes, what that means, especially if you have declining real incomes, is that you can't buy what you were able to buy 5 years ago, right? It's not a matter of getting ahead. You are falling behind. You can't have the things, you can't have the experiences that you used to have. And that's a reality that Canadians are increasingly waking up to. Now, if you look at political responses and you look at David Eby, for example, um, he got the memo, right? Like if you listen to what he's saying, he is saying he's concerned about these things. He's looking like he's trying to do something. You can argue about whether his solutions will work, but you can see that he's trying. The problem with the Trudeau government is that they're denying, right? So, you know, a big announcement for the Liberals would be to say that, inflation is coming down. But all that means is that expensive things are getting more expensive at a slower rate. It doesn't mean that it's easier to get by. And they play games on the GDP numbers, right? They'll say total GDP is up when they know real GDP is down, and our per capita GDP is down. And, you know, it's not about scoring points in a scrum at this point. It's actually about, do you know what's wrong? And are you going to try and make it better? And if you don't even admit something's wrong, then why would anyone believe you're going to try and make it better?
It reminds me, it's like the first argument. It's like the first thing you do in an argument with your spouse. It's like you acknowledge their feelings. It's like you gotta
Well,
do this.
Is that how it works?
Yes, it is. It is. It
How's
works
it
with,
supposed to work, Mike?
yeah, yes. Well, I want to, because I think, and you did some really interesting work, Greg, I think tucking into this and what it means for different policy, like how different types of voters prioritize policy, different types of policies. But before that, I want to set the table a bit with the data you also collected on sort of appetite for transforming the economy and how it shifted
Right.
2024 to 2020. So it's interesting to me because in 2020, 2021, you're seeing this kind of like when you ask Canadians, you know, do you think the economy is COVID has highlighted how the economy is not working? Do you think do you think COVID is actually, before COVID it was basically working, could be fixed, but it's okay, or don't agree? You know, 2020, 2021, generally people, the majority of people, 50%, right, are saying, actually, the economy's not working. Like, we got to transform it. And then 40% sort of saying the same. And now in this moment, which is interesting because I would say at that moment in time, things were scary,
Right.
but right, like it was broadly okay. We didn't have kind of inflation taking off in 2020 and 2021 in the same way. And now we're in that context where actually, like, I would say, I think what surprises me in this moment, people's wallets aren't working, but they seem to have taken the position that there's less appetite to transform the economy. Sorry, and so to the numbers there now, right? It's like 45-45. It's kind of evenly split
Sure.
between, yeah, okay. What is going on with that? Why has that shift happened over the last 4 years?
Well, I mean, a lot of people are comfortable, right? So people were afraid during COVID that they would lose the comfort that they were experiencing. But that didn't happen. In fact, net savings went up, right? Basically, a lot of money flowed into the economy. And there's actually a debate whether we've even spent all that money yet. It's a big issue in the U.S. because when those savings run out, it's going to be a different economic game than we're seeing right now. But here in Canada, what happened is two conflicting shifts. So on the one hand, there's fewer people that agree we need to radically transform our economy. But I pick pretty tough language, right? So the fact that 45% say we need to radically transform our economy should warm Jeff's heart. And what should warm his heart even more is we also ask people to agree, disagree on the whole. Our free enterprise economic system works pretty well. And in the midst of the COVID downturn, we had 54% agreeing with that statement. Today, 4 years later, we only have 36% agreeing with that statement. Now, they're not with Jeff yet, right? They haven't gone all the way to we need to change the fundamentals of this, but they've gone to the fence. They're now in doubt, whereas before they weren't. And so as we look at the reaction to declining real incomes, the fact that it's harder to live the life you used to live, there's now questions about what's the best way to get back on track. And at the moment, federally, if you look at the conservative success, you could be excused by saying, well, people are embracing a right-wing agenda as a way to solve the concerns that they have. But actually, when we go and test specific policies, we see lots of support for Bernie type ideas, that there could be a left populist response to this as much as there could be a right populist response to this.
That was what, when Mike shared those with me, Greg, that was leapt out at me, of course, was that there was as strong a populist proposition there for Jagmeet Singh, for example, as there is for Pierre Poilievre. What's
Yes.
counterintuitive is that Pierre Poilievre is excelling at it and Jagmeet is not yet. The second one I just would be interested in your comment on was a countercurrent, which is or cross current of taxation. So people
Right.
love the idea of taxing the rich and hate and also want lower taxes, which I
Right.
thought was a factor in Alberta where Rachel Notley seemed to get headwinds because she promised to increase taxes on the rich and people thought that was a general tax increase. So it's tricky ground, but it is very interesting.
So that is really an interesting point. So Rachel Notley had a win the battle, lose the war issue, right? She promised that she was going to raise taxes on business. And that, even at the end of campaign, was very positive across almost every one of our value segments. The only group that had a hard time buying into that were the populist conservatives, deferential conservatives, business liberals. They liked that idea. But the brand of the NDP, right? Who's going to best be able to help you get ahead dropped. Because people said, I like the idea of taxing big business, but what will that do to our economy if we do that? Are we going to attract investment? Are we going to attract jobs? Are we actually going to be better off? So it's like, when you're flying on Air Canada and they come by with the chocolates, right? You could have one of those chocolates. You really want to have one of those chocolates, but are you going to be better off if you have one of those chocolates? Sometimes taxing the rich and big business is like a chocolate. It tastes real good at
Greg,
the moment, but you're going to wear it in the future.
I don't know what section you're in on Air Canada. I don't get chocolates in zone.
chocolates.
Oh, no,
Zone
they make
5.
you pay. They make you pay.
They're $10 each. But
zone.
There's
Greg,
no free lunch.
I think now too, people can see that in real time because towers go up in Vancouver, Amazon and other big firms slosh in thousands of people. Then suddenly there's a problem and thousands of them leave and the towers are empty. So footloose capital is more of a real thing for people than it was when it was pulp mills and mines and things like that.
Let's set this up too, just before we go deeper into the policies and the support. Can you talk to us about the groups, Greg? Like the populist conservatives, the deferential conservatives, the business, like can you help us understand them? Yeah.
Sure. And one of the things that I think is important for people to understand about public opinion is that the most important people, the people that move back and forth between parties, are conflicted. They hold points of view that if they focus, so let's say I believe we should pay as we go, right? But I also believe that I'm also suspicious of the profit motive, right? So we have a group like that and we call them pay-as-you-go moderates, right? And to me, they look like Saskatchewan New Democrats. So Saskatchewan New Democrats led the country in developing social programs, but also had one of the best fiscal records in the country. And also, by the way, produced some of the best public servants in the country, especially in the Blakey administration. But so when you look at those sort of people, on the one hand, they'd be nervous about, for instance, David Eby's deficit. That will actually make them nervous. But on the other hand, they might be afraid that a center-right party would cut social services that they care about. And so they have to resolve that conflict. And when you understand what people's conflicts are, then if you're trying to run a campaign, that tells you how to frame your issues and what issues to focus on.
So just to give you a plug here, innovativeresearch.ca, there is a tab there for news, and a lot of the public polls Greg's referring to are up there, and there's a lot of meat in those polls, and Greg's well known in the industry for having a lot of deep dives and smart research that goes beyond the top line that we normally see from other public pollsters. Won't name names. But if you look at some of those ones, and Greg's been reeling off a few of them, I believe it's business liberals, thrifty moderates, you've got a populist conservatives, deferential conservatives, core left. Which one am I missing?
Well, did you do left liberals?
Left liberals, right? And there's 6 groups, and they're about equivalent in size, right? They're about 15 to 20% of the population each, roughly.
Well, the single biggest group are business liberals. So
Right.
about a quarter of the electorate at any given time are people that believe we should focus on creating opportunity, not redistributing wealth, believe that the profit motive encourages the best in people, not the worst, but believe that government spending should be based on need, not ability to pay. And that's a really big distinction. We basically we look at, so that opportunity versus redistribution is sort of like the fundamental modern political schism. And so that explains free enterprise versus New Democrat. Within the free enterprise side, fiscal issues tends to split people up. But within the middle slice, the sort of capital L liberal slice, there are people that feel more or less comfort with the profit motive, right? So you can think about the Sheila Copps and the Merles versus the Paul Martins of the world. And when you look at this particular version of the liberals federally, they're very much following the Sheila Copps, if in some days actually feeling a lot more like New Democrats in the way they're talking about the need for equity as opposed to focusing on creating opportunity, which has been a challenge for the NDP. And one of the Liberals' big successes has been pulling in those center-left swing voters.
We talk about the conservative buckets because it's making me think too. Like, so you have the populist conservatives and the deferential ones. And is Pierre Poilievre kind of our first real lean in a leader towards more of that populist conservative, maybe compared to his predecessors?
I mean, Scheer was very much of that ilk. O'Toole said he was that sort of Tory, and then got in there, embraced carbon taxes and stuff, which ended up being a big problem for him because he signaled one way and turned another, which I think everyone that drives in Vancouver traffic can appreciate how frustrating that is. But so when we look at those sorts of issues, populism has been there. Harper is someone that came out of the Reform Party, the populist side of the coalition, but acted in, a very top-down manner, had more a Mulroney style, even if he had more Preston language.
So what shifts have you seen, wrapping this all together in terms of that middle-class angst, undercurrents of populism? How have you seen these groups shifting over time?
Well, I think the biggest thing, I think, is actually not so much about values, but about emotion. And what we're seeing, and I would argue in large part because of perceptions of declining standard of living, but not just that. It's also things like, a big part of this is healthcare, right? We've seen more and more people say, I can't get access to the healthcare I need, and when I get the healthcare I need, it's not very good anymore. And so there's just this sense that I'm not getting what I was promised, and that has made people angry. So one of the things that we did that's also on the website is that we tested 7 different conservative ads, 3 in French and 4 in English. And I included sort of a range of tones. So I picked some that I thought were a bit edgy, a bit aggressive. And one of the things that we found is that, and they came across as angry. And what was interesting was that those angry ads were very well received. And that is a little bit reminiscent of what we're seeing in the States. So what's happening in Canada, what's happening in the States are quite different. But what drove Trump in the first place was the anger that so many people in the United States have at the people inside the Beltway as not listening, not understanding, being tone deaf, not being responsive. And so every time, Trump was accused of something outlandish or did something outlandish, it was a proof point that he wasn't like the insiders, right? And so even though it was a nutty thing to do, and in any other age would have seen him knocked out as a leader, in this case, it was proof he's not an insider, and that's what I want. I want someone to shake things up, even if I don't agree with everything he says, because the safer option won't change anything, and something's got to change. And so what we're now seeing, and this is something liberals need to take note of, is we're seeing that this type of angry messaging is really working well. And the other thing is that, New Democrats that are trying to get the other side of this, Poilievre's being very careful not to get pinned as the puppet of the fat cats, right? So he's gone now twice to business audiences and said, don't come asking me for favors unless you convince the public it's the right thing to do. Your fancy lobbyists aren't going to have any sway with me. There is a little irony that, his key campaign advisor runs a lobbying firm, but
But
we'll let the liberals
he
make
also
that.
stays away from institutional labor and speaks to working people directly. I think that's another important point. Yeah.
It is. Whereas if you look at Doug Ford, who's had good success, Doug Ford's actually reached out directly to organized labor.
Yeah.
So there's no one road to success. And, at the moment we have is a polling victory, not an electoral victory, right? So we don't know for sure what the end of the federal story is going to be, although honestly it looks very difficult that it would be anything other than quite a sizable conservative win at this point.
Well, just looking at an example of a policy that one could argue is kind of top-down driven is the carbon tax. The manner in which it was introduced in BC initially, but also, it's seen as one of those policies that's, got the support of all the economists, which is usually the first sign of trouble.
Right.
So now you have the prime minister who's leaned into it. You have the premier here who's leaned into it. You've done a recent poll on electrification and some shifting attitudes there. What are you seeing on that energy landscape right now, and that tension between affordability and climate?
So it's important to know that the fundamentals that drove the desire for electrification and energy transition in the first place are still there, right? So people are concerned about climate change. They believe it's real. They want to do something about it. If they have a view of whether the energy transition is good or bad, they still are more likely to say it's good than say it's bad. And that hasn't changed in the last year. But what has changed is support for political narratives. So the idea that we should do what it takes to shift from high carbon to low carbon energy, even if that means pain, versus um, the effort to do that is at risk of creating economic harm and not really making any difference. Those two arguments, the story has changed dramatically in just a couple of years. We've gone from 11 points more taking the leadership point of view to 11 points more taking, this may cause more harm than good and won't make any real difference. And so, there's obviously some pretty big external factors, the war in the Ukraine, first and foremost. We also have, the reality that, well, China is beating the world when it comes to bringing in renewable energy resources. It's also beating the world when it comes to commissioning new coal power plants. And, it doesn't take very many, it really only takes a few weeks of new coal-fired plants in China to wipe out any benefit that we do in Canada. And so again, that's one of those issues of conflict that we talk about, where yes, people would like to do something about climate change. They're very concerned about what this might do to the future. But they're not sure that these policies are actually the answer to that problem. And one of the big issues where I think, again, the Liberals have really misread the room is, we did some work back when the carve out, the carbon tax carve out for Atlantic Canada was done. And we asked people, do you think there shouldn't have been a carve out at all? Do you think that carve out was okay, but there shouldn't be any more changes to the carbon tax? Do you think we still need the carbon tax as an important tool, but we should do more to cushion the blow in these difficult times? Or do you think we should get rid of it altogether? Only a third of the public says get rid of it altogether. About half the public, a little over half the public, has some point of view that says the carbon tax is critical, but we need to do something to cushion the blow. And so rather than lean into the reason that the Atlantic Caucus pushed so hard to make an exemption in the Atlantic and say we need to recognize this is actually part of a bigger deal and we need to reconsider the whole policy, the way we're implementing it, should and basically put pause on it. If they put pause on it, the issue shifts from being increasing taxes on you at a time that you can ill afford it to what you're going to do in the long term about climate change. And so if they had extended in a policy sense the decision that they made in the carve out to other issues, they would have had a 50% coalition and Poilievre would have had a 30% coalition. But right now, the way they've done it, they've given Poilievre the 50% coalition and they have the 30% coalition. And what's even worse about that for the Liberals is that there are three other parties, two major parties that are fighting with them on that position, the NDP, the Bloc, and the Greens. Whereas Poilievre only has the PPC challenging him, and they're basically, not a meaningful force. So right now, Poilievre has all of half the public, whereas the Liberals are fighting with three other parties for a third of the public, and that's just bad electoral math. And what I wonder, and we've everyone here has been involved in council and governments, and one of the things that there was a great story about Howard Pawley and Cliff Scotton. And Cliff Scotton is a well-regarded New Democratic operative who had done campaigns all across the country. And the story was that he had been hired to say 4 words to Howard Pawley once a month, which is, Howard, I think not. And that just to be the grown-up in the room, to say to the premier, just stop for a second, think about it again. And there's a real question in my mind, is there anyone that has that role around Justin Trudeau? Because if you think about, I'll give you conservative examples, both Bill Davis and Mike Harris, when the House was sitting, would have a Wednesday morning breakfast at the Albany Club where there might be 2 people that got a paycheck from the premier. The other people in that room did not get paychecks from the premier. And the premier would regularly get shit from the room about stupid things government was doing for no good reason. And would come out of that and give his head a shake and say, we've got to do better. We need to relook at these policies. And I think that basic issue of governance, who has a mandate to say truth to power, is really critical to successful governance.
Well, in BC, if we shift our focus to provincial politics on the remaining time we have here, does there need to be truth to power conversations or truth to opposition conversations going on? You've done the electoral math over the years. You've lived it in the 90s. The math doesn't seem to make any sense right now for the center-right part of the spectrum in BC. What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, if the election were today, which it's not, but if the election were today, my bet is the NDP would gain seats. And they would gain seats in the interior. I'd be watching Kamloops and Prince George the way we used to. I'd be watching the Cariboo. Even some parts of the Okanagan, I think, could flip if the election were right now. Because right now, the BC Conservatives are running ahead of the BC United, but not enough to actually win seats. And I shouldn't, let me restate that. They're going to win seats, but they're nowhere near far enough ahead to win a majority of seats. And so you've got a situation where 2 things are going on that favor the NDP. Number one, there's no substantive time for a change in BC. I mean, time for change always runs 50%. You can take the most popular government on their most popular day and half the country thinks it's time for a change. Because they're not ideologically aligned with that party, never vote for that party, never would vote for that party. And right now, time for change is in the low 50s in BC. In Ottawa, we're talking about 70% time for change.
Mhm.
And basically, governments are in trouble once time for change gets into the 60s. So number one, there's no time for change. So even if the the right were united, the center right, the NDP would probably get reelected. But then on top of that, you have a very bad vote split that is likely going to see, sort of the core seats that would have voted Socrat or BC Liberal probably go mostly Conservative. And anything that's close to a swing seat going to the NDP.
And where's that leave BC United?
Well, the issue is that what we don't know is what happens as the election get closer and people wake up and say, who are the BC Liberals again? Because right now, federal politics is really carrying the day in terms of people's everyday life. But people will tune in again, and we just don't know how big a difference that will make. If you're the BC United, you think that's for sure going to happen. If you're the BC Conservatives, you think they've missed their boat. But we'll see. We don't know. And honestly, in the short run, it's hard to imagine any solution other than a sort of Australian National Liberal Party split, where basically there's a deal done at the top that says you run in these seats, we run in these seats, and these seats that the NDP can never win will both run. But that's very difficult, right? At the end of the day, politics is about people. Rusted and Kevin have a history. Rusted left what were then the BC Liberals, and Kevin basically said good riddance to you. And how they overcome that to actually try and make that deal will be a challenge. And then they have to convince their two parties to go along with it if they do decide they want to do that.
How important?
Yeah, go ahead.
How important thinking that through too, like, because this next election is going to be so important for what the legacy of that divide is, right? Really based on how the Conservatives can show up in the next election. And I want to relate this to the point you were making about the importance of being able to channel anger, right? About how that message is really what's going to land with folks. So if I'm Kevin Falcon or I'm John Rostad, I'm looking at those two men and thinking, I think they have very different abilities very different communication styles and very different abilities to harness that anger and kind of be, what's the message that's going to help them kind of outflank the other.
Well, the issue is that, the group that has been driving electoral outcomes since, 2017 is what I would call the struggling middle class, right? Who primarily live in suburban Vancouver. Why Rusted's doing so well is he's appealing to a base vote for the Free Enterprise Coalition as primarily a conservative vote that likes some of the simple positions that he's taking. But the things that he says that those people like are not necessarily things that are going to work with him with these besieged middle class voters in suburban Vancouver. And so he could, frankly, probably the best scenario for the NDP is that Rustad continues the size of lead over the BC Liberals that he has, continues to say some of the things that he's saying, and basically hands over the swing vote in suburban Vancouver to the NDP because they're just pushed away. And if you look at the federal Tory story, right, it's very clear that in 2018 and 2021, or 2019 and 2021, the two successive Conservative leaders found ways to scare swing voters back to the Liberals. So that's now Rustic could tack to the center, and we'll see whether or not that happens, which is exactly what Poilievre's doing right now, except for the occasional visit to the anti-trans stuff. He's mostly focused on pocketbook opportunity, things like that, which is going to pull in Coquitlam and places like that, Surrey.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon right now where, Poilievre would win the federal vote in BC quite significantly by my read of it. And David Eby looks like he's on track to win the provincial mandate by a considerable margin, mainly because of the vote split. But as you outlined, there's other reasons too. So
Yeah, I mean, it's bigger. It's not. He's not accidentally winning,
yeah,
right? His net favorables are the best. Like people
yeah.
like him way more than they like Rustad and Kevin. Not
Mhm.
a little bit more, a lot more.
Well,
Um,
Angus Reid came out with their quarterly, and they had him at 48 favorable, which is I think probably the same as relatively same as other pollsters, and that's good grade.
it's an excellent grade. So
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at um, there are two in-government transitions the BC NDP have managed, right? The first one to Glenn Clark and the second one to Eby. In both cases, and I don't know how much of Geoff's fingerprints are over this, but in both cases, they went with a flurry of activity. They demonstrated change with a series of announcements. And I think what Eby did that was even better than the Clark thing was that Eby, in his flurry of announcements, also directly took on the obvious attack points for the opposition. Went back to the issues that he might have been vulnerable on and got in front of them and got very strong positive reactions to what he was saying. So, so this isn't just because the free enterprise side of the spectrum is split. This is because the NDP is doing a lot of things right. Now, whether that will last, because the real question here is, will their policies actually turn the standard of living crisis around or not? And that's where, if you're the premier and his advisors, um, you need to take a hard look at real numbers of standard of living, real disposable income. Where's the growth coming from? And in some regards, there's signs that they don't totally get it, right? So their policies on liquefied natural gas. If you are trying to think about what's going to balance BC's budgets in 2035, and you shut down liquefied natural gas, you show me anything else, any 10 other things that can come close to adding as much money to pay for the increased demand for healthcare that we will have than expanded liquefied natural gas. I don't know what will. And the government's basically shut down further liquefied natural gas. Another example is just
Well,
this week.
I don't think so, Greg. That's another one of
Well,
these podcasts. Take it.
yeah,
Take another
it'd be
look.
another
But
debate. Yeah.
Well,
Well, and it'd be great if I was wrong, but there was another announcement this week. The government has put in place some regulations which have um, derailed issue permits for mines, right? So we're all saying critical minerals are a big part of BC and Canada's future, right? The part of the energy transition is we need metals to do it. There are nowhere enough metals to enable the energy transition, even if the policy framework was in there to make it all happen. But we've just put some mines on hold that had permits, right? This isn't about future permits, right? We just had a court case in BC that says the government has 18 months to get its mineral tenures in place, but over those 18 months, they can continue to issue tenures. Yet here they are not issuing new tenures, actually taking back tenures they already have in place. So, it's that debate, that's a meaningful debate. That's the sort of debate that Mulroney would be having, except he'd make it funny.
I have a
I think-
historical footnote, though, Greg. When you and Mike were reducing Ujjal Dosanjh's administration to rubble, there were two people left standing, and on the center left, such as it was, people said, "Oh well, Joy McPhail and Adrian Carr, then the leader of the Green Party, should get together." And in focus groups that I attended, everybody, no matter where they had been in the voting pool, thought that was the most cynical political tactic possible. And I think that's a huge risk for Falcon and Rustad, were they to try some maneuver like that, is that they would be reduced in the eyes of their followers to carpetbaggers.
Well, and honestly, in the absence of time for change, it's very hard for them to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
When people are afraid of the NDP, then they're going to be a lot more open to compromise among those two parties than when they actually think there's no real problem. So what are you guys doing? It must just be because of your ambitions.
I do wonder though that if there was some kind of event where they consolidated, found some way to cooperate, whether that in and of itself creates momentum that wakes people up, right? And makes it interesting. Because I don't think I don't think the government's performance ratings on some of the top issues are that good, like affordability and crime and healthcare. But they're not, they're doing well in spite of that. And I think the premier's done well as a performer in the media, and he gets out in front of issues, as you say. But I wonder whether the opportunity for the opposition is more process based than policy based initially, right? Just to say, because they look like a bunch of losers right now because they're so far back in the polls and they're fighting with each other. It's like, I don't know why the public would take it seriously. Would
Well,
take
and
them
Well, but
seriously.
it's
yeah, picking up on Jeff's observation, I mean, the historical reference to Joy McPhail and Adrian Carr, like, yeah,
yeah,
that would be opportunistic because they were two solitudes effectively. This would be a coming back together. I feel like voters would probably have a slightly it just seems more authentic for
you know,
Rustad and Falcon.
yeah, I think the average voter doesn't think this hard about all this.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the Conservative Party, such as it is in BC, is more of a vote than it is an organization.
Yeah.
And it's a vote that wants to express itself. And if Rust is seen as moving too far away from their emotional base, something else will emerge to be the vehicle for that emotion. So it's it's a good time to be a New Democrat in BC.
Well, it's a good time to be a podcast host and have guests like you come on the show and share your wisdom, Greg. So thank you very much for a wide-ranging conversation that will spill over for the three of us here into the strategy suite. And we look forward to having you on Hotel Pacifico again soon.
Guess, if you're like me and you get excited about the prospect of road trips and snacks, I've got a hot tip for you. About 2 hours outside Vancouver, towards the Fraser Canyon, tucked into the forest off Highway 1, you will find the Hope River General Store and RV Park. It's a one-stop shop where you can get gas, liquor, lotto cards, and wild-caught smoked salmon. This is made possible by General Store owner and entrepreneur Jolena Hope, who also works as a fish sampler and prepares the fish herself. Since the age of 15, Jolena has been testing sockeye and pink salmon runs on the Fraser River as part of the ongoing fish monitoring work undertaken by her home community, the Yale First Nation. The test fishery provides essential in-season information for the management of salmon and, thanks to Jolena, a little something to pair with your cheese and crackers while you're cruising down the highway, crushing your favorite playlist, or maybe binging your favorite political podcast. For Jolena, access to a reliable and fast network is vital to operate and grow her businesses. She relies on the power of TELUS Pure Fiber to order goods and services, process credit cards, and enable debit transactions. The residents and visitors to her RV park rely on it too to take appointments and stay connected to family. Jolena is able to join meetings virtually, download and send large files, none of which was easy to do before her community had access to Pure Fiber internet. That changed in 2021 when Yale First Nation gained access to TELUS Pure Fiber through the Connecting British Columbia program, a partnership with the province of BC. Rural and Indigenous connectivity makes a world of difference for small business owners like Jolena and is an example of how TELUS is advancing economic reconciliation in BC. So, next time you're traveling on Highway 1 in the Upper Fraser Valley, stop at the Hope River General Store and grab some salmon. It's a delicious way to support economic reconciliation and better than packing a sandwich. You can read more about Jolena's story and others like it in the annual TELUS Reconciliation and Connectivity Report at telus.com/reconciliation.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Today in Strategy Suite, I think we want to get to something that's been, I think, in the headlines for close to a month now. I think it goes all the way back to January 30th to the comments Selena Robinson made that ultimately culminated in her resigning from cabinet and then leaving the NDP. And I want to kind of make sure let's go through this in chunks and kind of, I think, walk through some of this, because I think all of us have been in the scenario where we've dealt with departures from cabinet, forced resignations, and they are always really hard on, I think, everybody involved. So let's take some time with this one. And Geoff, I'll start with you. Because I think there was a shift really from initially when the comments were made by Selena Robinson on a sort of online forum talking about, the lands of Palestine being just a patch of, I think what she said, just a patch of barren land, basically. And then
Crappy piece of land.
crappy piece of land. Thank you. And sort of quickly apologizing, I think, after that. But then this was on a Friday. Over the weekend, things seemed to shift really quickly. Do you understand what was happening over that weekend after her comments?
Well, I understand what I could see. I think two things happened. Was the news broke about her comments, which needed a very careful assessment and a judgment, by the premier and his team. But she also was accused by the union that represents instructors of improperly interfering in the labor relations process, because there'd been an ongoing discussion about disciplining one instructor at Langara who had made what were alleged to be anti-Semitic comments, and she was found not to have, and she was back, and so on. Which in my mind was as concerning in some respects as the comments themselves, but with the advantage of 2020 hindsight, but I think it could have been concluded at the time, the nature of the comments plus that demand put it in the zone of leaving cabinet, or at least moving to a different place in cabinet. And that's ultimately what happened, but in a very, very destructive way. So when it was clear that her initial apology was all there was going to be, the Muslim community was outraged and issued a decision that they would not welcome any NDP candidates to mosques or any of their institutions during the course of the election. And that led to, so I'm told by the media, I don't know any of the inside story, but urgent meetings by the premier with Muslim leaders, and then a caucus meeting for which she apologized a second time in much more graphic ways, more detail. But at the end of that caucus meeting, the premier emerged and announced that she had left cabinet. And now we know that sometime later, a week and a half, 2 weeks later, she had further conversations with him and his staff, but decided in frustration to leave. So on the one hand, we had the Muslim community up in arms demanding that she be let go. She's eventually let go after a caucus meeting. And then the Jewish community reacts very negatively. And the premier, as recently as last Friday, was having urgent meetings with key leaders in the Jewish community. So that situation all around resulted in the loss of Selena Robinson, a frontbencher, to sit as an independent until until the election, when she had intended to leave anyway. So that's the nutshell of it. I guess the question is, whether people believe that in fact, in the first instance, she should have been asked to step aside more graciously on the Friday, and whether all this was more or less preventable, because no one has argued really that her remarks could go unnoticed. They had to be responded to. Anyway, I'll stop there. It's a long conversation.
Yeah, well, I'll pick up on it, because I think some of what's hard in this, and some of what's really highly unusual in this, is when you look at where the pressure was coming for her resignation. I mean, I think your point is interesting. Like if her resignation had come earlier, maybe this wouldn't happen. But really, the pressure over the weekend was coming from within the party. I'd say the opposition, I think, wasn't clear yet. They've shifted, but they weren't really clear. They didn't have a clear, hard stance on this, and the opposition came from within the party. And I think that lays the seeds for when Selena Robinson does leave the NDP. She has this letter with this very clear, strong language saying to her fellow caucus members and to the premier, "You broke my heart." And I just don't know that I can think of anything like this in recent memory, to have a cabinet and a cabinet departure and a party departure that is someone so seasoned and
I
so
can think
personal.
of one.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Yeah.
And Jane Philpott, which was a very
Yeah.
public, difficult break over circumstances happening behind the scenes that we weren't seeing. But
Jody Wilson-Raybould, though, was not, even at that juncture, not nearly as a long tenured politician or as experienced as Selena
but
Robinson.
she was justice minister, so
she was very senior, yes, but she
Yeah.
was what, like a few years in.
emblematic of the
3 years in.
Trudeau. I mean, in her case, I mean, I was going to riff a bit on caucus defections are hard, right? But there's a continuum of impact that they have. And I've lived through some of them, which were minor blip in the water and no one even noticed they were gone versus seismic impact. And Jody Wilson-Raybould was seismic impact. And it probably cost the Liberals a majority government in 2019. That whole, because they were riding high in the polls, and then they spent 4 months navel gazing over the controversy in Ottawa, and it was bad. It was an internal bloodletting. And Philpott's departure too was harmful too as a collateral damage to that. Now, in this particular situation, obviously provincial politics, we've seen John Rustad leave, and we just talked about that with Greg Lyle. That's had
best firing he ever suffered.
that was big impact. That was as well. Now, Selena Robinson, I think the hard thing in caucus defections is the political implications of this may be felt down the road or not. But in the meantime, you're still there in the same building. You're still sitting there in the same chamber. You have all this history with these people, right? She was finance minister and many other hats that she wore integral to the operation for many years. And all of a sudden she's written this letter and she's gone to the other side, or at least independent. And that, just from an emotional point of view here, that is going to be hard for the group, right? And there'll be a lot of people who have very close relationships with Selena Robinson who are not following her or staying in the NDP. And that's, I know you get into these situations where it's like you're seen talking to them in the hallway and people are, get funny about that. And it really requires a bit of maturity to kind of get through that. How do we act together now? It's,
But
sometimes
if we just roll back quickly, and I really want to summarize this, this had been happening for her. Being on the receiving end of brutal anti-Semitism had been her reality since October the 7th, in an area where she was responsible for post-secondary education, which was a battleground over free speech versus anti-Semitism. And she was seeking very publicly to rein in anti-Semitism on campus and was involved in controversy on it. However, and goes to the health of the NDP, which of course I care deeply about, the convention had a debate in November about the issues of Gaza and Palestine. It came up with a consensus resolution, which met the test of some of the Jewish activists I was talking to on the floor. She was there. So that was a good thing because it satisfied all the cross currents that are in the party. Well, she had to walk into the convention, though, through protesters who were holding effigies of bloody babies, chanting that she was guilty of genocide. So you need to put her own state of mind and her own personal experience into the context here. However, she's the minister of the crown. She can't make a statement that says, and it was also very troubling for a lot of First Nations people that, there was nothing there. As some people allege, there was nothing here and just a few people on a crappy piece of land. And somehow those of us who came later made a magical place out of it. And so in retrospect, I wasn't there, but those kinds of problems made this, I think, along with the labor relations issue, there was a different path. Certainly, it's hard to imagine a path it would be very hard to find a path that was as tough on the government as the one taken. With the crisis with the Muslim community, which is very, very important in a large part of the Lower Mainland, and then a follow-on one with the Jewish community. So very, very difficult, but it's over. And we'll see if it has the kind of repercussions you talk about, Mike, because I know you're right. It can happen overnight.
It's hard to know. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't feel like it's going to have the same repercussions as a Jody Wilson-Raybould, for instance, but it kind of depends whether it joins with some other event that happens that we don't know about yet, or like it connects with some other factors. And to me, as a one-off,
Von Palmer, one of our guests on Hotel Pacifico, who's capable of savage writing, has done 3 savage editorials on David Eby since then, or columns, and you can get reelected notwithstanding Von's savage columns, but there's a reassessment maybe going on of how some of these things are managed and how it plays out. So we'll see.
We will see.
It's hard. It'd be just hard to see in light of the conversation we just had with Greg, how opposition isn't in a position to take advantage of that stuff anyways, because at the end of the day, this comes down to a vote. And is this actually going to shift votes? I don't know.
I think, yeah,
Hard
but
to follow. Yeah.
yeah, but I'd bring it back to the NDP, because I would say, I mean, basically you have two groups of people calling each other racist. And this has been a really hard time. And I think, you know, those relationships become more and more important the longer a government gets in the tooth. So this is, I think, the kind of thing that could come up maybe more internally to the party and more internally to the relationships of
This could
the
make the
NDP.
2028 election very close.
I look forward to that episode of
Not
Hotel
over yet,
Pacifico.
2024. It's
We're
not
all
over yet.
even more gray haired and less hair. Okay. Let's move it on. Speaking of future elections, to Pierre Poilievre at the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade last week. I think Greg teed us up really nicely. I think making a really interesting observation on an effort I think Pierre Poilievre is making to distance himself from the business community, right? Not be sort of that archetype of the conservative, of the business friendly conservative. And he made comments there that I think really underscore that. So I'll read them directly. He said, frankly, when I meet resource companies, they come to Ottawa and all they do is suck up to the Liberal government. They have no backbone and no courage, and they don't fight for their workers. I want to see corporate leaders actually fighting for their workers and fighting for their paychecks instead of sucking up to the very people who are blocking these jobs. Mike, what's your thoughts on how that went over in the room?
Well, I was just wondering if I can read that quote aloud now too. If we could do like a reading, and we could all read it together
With different
in
emphasis,
harmony.
yes.
You know, it's a spicy quote. Nelson Bennett's article on that in Business in Vancouver was cited as clipping of the week in Cursive Politics this week. So it's this Nelson's reporting is shot across the country on podcasts wherever you listen. But it's it's an interesting approach that Poilievre has. I mean, he is, as Greg mentioned earlier, he is speaking over the heads of corporate leaders and union leaders and talking straight to the people. And we've seen this in Boris Johnson. We see this with Trump. We see this with Doug Ford. There is conservative politicians are beginning to see a connectivity straight to workers, and forget about the guys in the suits. There's not many of them. There's not many votes there. They can't raise money like they used to. You don't have to rely on business leaders to raise money. They go direct out through all the tools that they have now. So they're not beholden. And you know, if I'm business community, I'd be paying attention to this. You know, I think it's more than theater. You know,
I think your last point is really important, Mike. We're now into provincially and federally that we're clearly in the post campaign finance reform era where it really depends on what you've got on the ground, and therefore not so much who you know and who could write a check for $20,000 because they can't do it. So yeah, very interesting reaction in that room to references to gatekeepers and stuff like that. So he's hitting some buttons that business people like, but to Greg's point about Brian Mulroney and the sort of big picture strategies that were proposed in the past, that's not really what works now for people who are worried about day-to-day bills. They're going to be very concerned about specific pieces. But I thought we should get briefly to the carbon tax thing.
Yes.
Because he's very anti-carbon tax, and Kevin Falcon has said he's got a convoluted position that says if Poilievre gets in and he's the premier, then he'll get rid of carbon tax. But basically, I think the light's sort of shifting now to David Eby to say, well, what's your position on the carbon tax? So far, he said, I favor it, but he has to raise it on April 1st, and then he'd be raising it again.
Well, he said
Well,
that he
just
would.
yeah.
He said that he would maintain a leadership position even if he was the last guy standing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so to be clear, so Poilievre set him up to say he called on Premier Eby and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to cancel the carbon tax hike that's coming on April 1st, like a real good throw down the gauntlet that got I think I understand it to be some of the best applause of the speech. So do you think the Eby government's going to be watching this at all? Or is there something for them to track on this? Or
I think they have to watch it. Yeah.
And any chance they'll is there an adjustment they can make based on this? Can they be seen? I mean, to kind of pick up on Greg Lyle too, right? Like you're in a tough position to a degree to which you're kind of protecting the principle of the thing versus kind of answering the emotional, the anger, the resentment of cost from the voters.
Well, you saw Wab Kinew get rid of the fuel tax. You see others proposing
Yeah.
to do that. You see carve-outs for heating tax. You could freeze it, as Christy Clark's government did for a number of years. So there's a lot of levers you could pull without, and still be the last person standing, really, for the most part. But I'm not quite sure. I think this is one of the interesting things I think about the upcoming election, and how this issue plays, whether it's a climate issue or an affordability issue, and how the various parties respond.
Last week, I was talking about those cold snaps, when we really need energy to keep us warm and cozy. But it's not just a matter of cranking up the thermostat. It's also about using energy more efficiently. Our sponsor, Fortis BC, recently announced it will invest a record $695.8 million to help its customers reduce their energy use over the next 4 years. It's a key pillar in the company's goal to lead the clean energy transformation in BC and reduce consumers' energy use, not to mention bringing down energy costs for consumers and businesses. Efficiency measures make a ton of difference. 740,000 tons, in fact. That's how many tons of CO2 emissions will be reduced over the life of these measures, equivalent to taking more than 228,000 passenger cars off the road. Don't worry, my car's in the garage. I walk to work. These measures are all part of Fortis BC's Clean Growth Pathway to 2050, and an important contribution to helping Canada meet its pledge to double energy efficiency by 2030. Hotel Pacifico's window to the world is triple paned, and Fortis BC is there to help. Energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I'm going to take a shot at Kevin Falcon. I know. I'm glad you're sitting down. But anyway, this is his response to just a good lesson. The first guest on our show was Bob Dewar, great advisor to John Horgan. So I'm channeling Bob Dewar, but it's in response to the announcement made yesterday, I guess, in Surrey, that there'd be another tower on the Surrey Hospital. Premier was there, Radio Nix was there, and so on. But Kevin Falcon's reaction was, oh, it's clearly made up over the weekend. They're trying to change the channel. It's a slap together announcement. We don't need any more Rob Shaws. We got Rob Shaw. We've got Bob Plummer. So you don't have to be a pundit. What you need to do is have a stronger message than that you don't like the communications approach of the government, because people are going to hear that and go, oh, did they announce something new on healthcare? Anyway, my 2 cents worth. I doubt if it'll be taken under advisement, but there you go.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a shot. It's a shotty kind of day. I'm going to take a shot at the Premier and Minister Callan for their initial response to Selena Robinson's letter. And I thought that they really ran the risk in the response of characterizing it as emotional. And I thought it was a bit paternalistic, their response. Now, I think the tone changed a lot in the subsequent days from the Premier. But I think they got on the wrong foot and were at risk of kind of basically turning this into a women's issue as much as it was an issue concerning what was happening with the letter. So to me, that was an example of being in a bit of a crisis and making it worse. And I think they pivoted and started to go in a different direction the next day and take it more seriously. But that's the problem with politics. Sometimes it's unexpected, and you get a microphone in your face and where you have time to think about it. So anyways, that was
different in hindsight.
my perception.
Yeah, interesting observation, Mike. All right, well, I will raise a glass. And I actually want to raise a glass to the village of Sayward, where they are debating whether to disincorporate as a municipality. And I actually want to there's a very interesting fellow by the name of Alex Turner there, who has actually got up in the fray of what has been some really dysfunctional debate about, about how to run the city, or how to run the municipality, and how to, whether or not to have chickens in the backyard. And tell our listeners to check out Justin McElroy, I think, at his finest in covering this discussion. And I want to say at his finest because one of the things I appreciate about him as a journalist is he actually has this ability to observe sort of things that are a bit absurd and potentially funny, and then still hold respect for them. Because I think if you read this piece, Justin McElroy covered on Sayward, he does kind of point out, I mean, the allegations flying between the councillors in the city and the sort of debate over the chickens and everything else is a bit ridiculous, but he manages to talk about that while kind of holding that there's a very important discussion here about local representation. And it's worth a read, and there's an accompanied video, and check it out. So I guess I kind of wrapping that up. It's again, Justin McElroy and the city and the municipality of Sayward. My glass is raised to you. Good luck with that discussion.
And he's on
All right.
sabbatical.
Who's on sabbatical? Justin
McElroy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
that was his swan song. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope he's listening to podcasts and he gets to hear this, because that was awesome. All right. That's it for us this week at Hotel Pacifico. I'd like to thank our guest, Greg Lyle, and I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and Fortis BC for making us possible. That's it for us this week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.